Everything I believed about this market was wrong, proof inside. I need to start with a confession that makes me uncomfortable to say out loud. I was wrong about this market for a long time. Not I missed a move, not I was early. I was wrong about how the market actually works, and because of that, I kept falling for the same trap. I would watch the price, then I would watch the headlines, and then I would stitch together a story that sounded smart after the fact. If you've ever felt like the market makes no sense, like price moves first and explanations get invented later, you're not crazy. That feeling is real, and in this video, I'm going to prove why it happens with receipts. Here's the contract I'm making with you right now. I'm going to show sources on screen as we go, and I will list every link in the pinned comment so you can verify every claim yourself. When something is confirmed by an official dataset or a primary source, I'll say that clearly. When something is not confirmed, I'll say that too. No hype, no guessing, no trust me. This is information and analysis, not financial advice. Now, when I say this market, I'm talking about silver and the wider precious metals complex around it. Silver is a perfect example because it lives in two worlds at the same time. It's a metal people treat like money, and it's also an industrial input used in real supply chains. That split personality makes it a magnet for narratives, and if you don't know how the system works, those narratives will fool you. So what did I believe that was wrong? I used to believe the story most people believe, that the price you see is a direct, honest reflection of physical reality. That if physical demand is strong, the price should rise. That if supply is tight, the price should explode. That if inflation prints hot, metals must go up. And when price didn't follow the story, I would reach for one of two lazy explanations. Either I'd say it's manipulated and stop thinking, or I'd say it's random and stop learning. Both were excuses, because here's what I missed. This market is not only a metal, it is a system, and the system has three layers that do not always move in sync. Layer 1 is the macro layer: interest rates, inflation, the dollar, and liquidity. Layer 2 is the paper layer: futures, options, margin, and positioning. Layer 3 is the physical layer: mining supply, recycling, industrial demand, inventories, and vault flows. When I treated the market as if only the physical layer mattered, I was reading one page of a 3-page document and calling it the truth. That's why I got fooled. So here's the method we're using today, and I want you to notice how strict it is. Every time I make a claim, I will do 5 things. First, I will say the claim in one clean sentence. Second, I will name the receipt, which source says it and when. Third, I will explain what that changes logically without drama. Fourth, I will say what remains unknown because uncertainty is part of honesty. And fifth, I will reset. I will restate where we are so you never get lost. If you stay with me, you will leave this video with a filter that protects you from noise. And near the middle of this video, I'm going to show you the turning point receipt that destroyed my old belief. It's not a rumor. It's not a theory. It's in public documents. Now let's start where most people get fooled first, the paper layer. When most people hear silver market, they imagine coins, bars, jewelry, solar panels, and mines. But the price most people quote, trade, and emotionally react to is not created by someone walking into a store and buying a bar. It is heavily influenced by financial markets where silver is traded as standardized contracts. One of the key venues is COMEX Silver Futures. Here's the first claim that changed my thinking. The market price you see is often a negotiation between leverage and collateral, not a direct vote on physical reality. Receipt, COMEX. Silver futures are standardized and deliverable contracts with published specifications. Those specifications are public. They tell you the contract size, the quality standard, and how delivery works. In other words, they tell you what is being traded on the paper layer. What does that change? It changes your mental model. A futures market is not just buyers and sellers. It is also margin, leverage, and risk limits. And those mechanics can create fast price moves that have nothing to do with a mine shutting down or a factory ordering more metal. What remains unknown? We don't see the entire global web of OTC derivatives and private hedges that sit alongside the exchange market, not accessible from public data. But we do not need perfect visibility to understand the basic truth. Leverage and collateral constraints move price. Reset. The first lesson is that this market is partly a leveraged financial system. If you ignore the leverage, you will misread the moves. Now, let's talk about the word that quietly controls the whole paper layer: margin. Margin is basically the deposit required to hold a leveraged position. It is a performance bond. Exchanges adjust margin requirements, especially during volatility, because they want to reduce the risk of defaults. That sounds boring. But it matters more than most people realize, because when margin increases, the cost of holding positions rises. Here is the claim. When the cost of holding positions rises suddenly, price can move violently, even if physical reality didn't change. Receipt. Exchanges publish margin requirements and margin information publicly. If you look at published margin pages for silver products, you can see that margin is real, it is disclosed, and it can change with volatility. What does that change? It explains why you can see a sharp dump or spike that doesn't seem to match the news. Sometimes the story is not the news. Sometimes the story is the plumbing. When margin rises, some participants must reduce exposure. That forced de-risking can hit price in a way that feels like the market is broken. It's not broken. It is reacting to constraints. What remains unknown? We don't know exactly which accounts are forced to sell or how each participant manages risk. But we can know the environment. If leverage is high and constraints tighten, pressure increases. Reset. The second lesson is that the paper market has a cost of carry in the form of margin. When margin changes, behavior changes. Now, the next receipt that destroyed my old belief comes from positioning. Here's the claim. Many big moves are not headline moves. They are positioning moves. Receipt. The U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission publishes Commitments of Traders Reports, often called QOT reports. These reports show how open interest is distributed across categories of traders. The reports don't predict the future and they don't reveal motives, but they show concentration. They show whether positioning is stretched. What does that change? It changes how you interpret chaos. When price moves on no news, it may not be random. It may be a positioning event. When price spikes and then reverses hard, it may not be a sudden change in physical supply. It may be an unwind, a hedge adjustment, or a risk constraint being hit. What remains unknown? The COT reports are a structured snapshot, not a full map of every exposure in the world. They also do not show every OTC hedge, not accessible from public data. So we do not pretend we can see everything. We just stop pretending we see nothing. Reset. So far, we have two receipts in place. 1. Published contract and margin rules prove the paper layer is a leveraged system. 2. Published positioning reports prove the market is also a balance of exposures, not a single opinion. Now we bring in the macro layer because this is where my thinking was embarrassingly shallow. I used to treat silver like it was only about silver. That was wrong. Silver is sensitive to the cost of money and to the value of the currency it is priced in because silver is traded globally, priced in dollars in many benchmarks, and competed against yield-bearing assets. Let's start with inflation, because inflation is the word that gets abused the most. Here is the claim. Inflation headlines do not matter in isolation. Real rates and policy expectations often matter more. Receipt. Inflation data is published publicly by official agencies like CPI releases, and real interest rates are tracked through official data sets and series, including real yield measures and published data series. This is not opinion. These are published numbers and published policy statements. What does that change? It changes what you track. Instead of arguing emotionally about whether inflation is hot, you ask a more disciplined question. Are real yields rising or falling? What is the central bank signaling? Are financial conditions tightening or easing? Those questions can matter because metals don't pay interest. If real yields rise, that can become a headwind. If real yields fall, that headwind can ease. This doesn't mean metals must rise or fall. It means the gravity changes. What remains unknown? No one can guarantee the future path of policy. Markets reprice, data changes, policy changes. That's why we track receipts and update, instead of pretending we can forecast perfectly. Reset. The macro layer matters because it changes the cost of money, which changes the competitive landscape for assets, and it changes risk appetite. Now let's talk about the dollar, because this is the second macro lever people ignore until it hurts. Here is the claim. The strength or weakness of the dollar can influence how commodities feel because many are priced in dollars and traded globally. Receipt. The US dollar index has a published methodology by the index operator. The point isn't to worship the index. The point is that the dollar is measurable and trackable, and when the dollar strengthens, it can create a headwind for dollar-priced assets, all else equal. When the dollar weakens, it can reduce that headwind. What does that change? It prevents false certainty. If someone tells you silver is going up because of X, but the macro receipts show real yields are rising and the dollar is strengthening, you have a reason to be cautious about simplistic narratives, not because the long-term story is wrong, but because the environment is pulling the other way. What remains unknown? Correlations are not laws. The relationship can change. Other forces can dominate. That's why we treat this as a layer, not as a single master key. Reset. Macro receipts give you the background gravity. They don't give you a prophecy, they give you context. Now, if you're still with me, you might be thinking, okay, paper mechanics matter, macro gravity matters, but does physical reality matter at all? Yes, physical reality matters. And this is where I need to be brutally honest about how I used to lie to myself. I used to take physical narratives and treat them like immediate price triggers. Industrial demand is booming, therefore price must explode now. That was the mistake. Industrial demand can be real and growing, but the translation to price is not immediate because the market clears through inventories, hedging, substitution, and time. So here are the physical receipts you need, and I'm going to name them clearly. Receipt 1, supply and demand surveys exist for this market, including annual reports that break down demand categories like industrial usage, investment demand, and jewelry. Receipt 2, official mineral statistics and production summaries exist, including published summaries of production, uses, and global flows. Receipt 3, vault and inventory data exists in key hubs, including published vault holdings data. Here is the claim. Physical reality is measurable, but it does not automatically control the day-to-day price you see on your screen. What does that change? It changes your discipline. You stop making absolute statements like, there is no silver or the market is fake, just because price didn't do what you wanted. You learn to say something more accurate. Here is what the annual survey says about supply and demand. Here is what official production data says. Here is what vault data says about holdings. Now let's compare that to the macro and paper layers to understand why price is behaving this way. What remains unknown? We do not have a single global real-time inventory ledger for all silver in all forms, not accessible. We do not have perfect visibility into private contracts and private stockpiles, not accessible. So we reject absolute claims. We use the best available public receipts. Reset. Physical matters, but it is one layer. The price is the intersection, not the physical layer alone. Now we arrive at the turning point, the moment I realized my old belief was the joke. I used to argue about the story. I used to fight about bullish and bearish headlines. I used to waste time debating opinions. And then I looked at the plumbing receipts, and I realized something simple. Sometimes the market is not moving because silver changed. It's moving because the constraints around trading silver changed. Here's the claim. In a leveraged market, changes in margin methodology and margin requirements can change price behavior even without a physical shock. Receipt, exchanges publish margin requirements and in some cases methodology updates. This is visible, it is disclosed, it is part of market infrastructure. And when volatility rises, exchanges can raise margins to protect the system. That increases the capital required to hold positions. That can force position reductions. Forced reductions can move price. What does that change? It changes how you interpret a violent move. It also changes how you manage your expectations. You can believe in a long-term physical thesis and still see short-term price events driven by paper constraints. That does not automatically invalidate the physical thesis. It means you were watching the wrong battlefield for short-term moves. What remains unknown? We don't know exactly how each participant responds, which positions are most fragile, or where the pain points are. But we can know the mechanism, and we can stop being surprised by it. Reset. The turning point is this. If you want to understand price behavior, you must respect the plumbing, leverage, margin positioning, and policy expectations. Now let me make this practical, because if this is just theory, it's useless. If you want to analyze this market in a way that doesn't embarrass you, you need a receipts-first dashboard, not a hot take dashboard, not a vibes dashboard, a receipts dashboard. First, you track macro receipts. Inflation releases and central bank statements, not because they tell you the future, but because they define the environment. You track real yields. You track what policy statements actually say, not what someone claims they said. Second, you track the dollar receipts. You don't have to worship the dollar index, but you should respect that currency conditions influence global pricing and risk appetite. Third, you track paper receipts, positioning and open interest. The COT reports exist for a reason. They help you see whether the market is crowded. Fourth, you track structure receipts, contract specs, and margin requirements. If you are ignoring margin, you are ignoring the cost of leverage, and leverage moves markets. Fifth, you track physical receipts, supply-demand surveys, official production statistics, and vault data where available. This is where you ground your long-term understanding. Now listen to how different that is from what most people do. Most people do the reverse. They start with a narrative, then they hunt for a chart that agrees, then they argue with strangers online. That's entertainment. It's not understanding. And this is where I have to say the most important sentence in this whole video, because it's the sentence that prevented me from getting fooled again. When the narrative and the receipts disagree, trust the receipts. That doesn't mean you become a robot. It means your emotions stop being the boss. Now let's do a clean summary of what we know versus what we don't, because this is how you build real trust with yourself and with your audience. What we know from public primary sources is that inflation data is published. Policy statements are published. Real yields can be tracked. Dollar index methodology is published. Futures contracts have published specifications. Margin information is published. Positioning reports are published. Annual supply-demand surveys exist. Official mineral statistics exist. Vault Holdings data exists for key hubs. What we do not know from public data is the exact full map of every private exposure across OTC derivatives, physical agreements, and collateral arrangements. We do not know motives behind every category in positioning reports. We do not know future policy decisions. We do not know future prices. Anyone who promises you certainty is selling you a feeling, not the truth. And once you accept that, something changes. You stop demanding a perfect story. You start watching the system. Now I want to address the trap that destroys retention and destroys investor thinking, the single cause explanation. People love single cause stories. Silver is up because inflation. Silver is down because manipulation. Silver moved because a headline. Those stories are attractive because they make you feel like you understand. But markets are multi-causal systems. In this market, one move can be influenced by policy expectations, real yields, dollar strength, risk sentiment, futures positioning, margin changes, and physical flows at the same time. So the right question isn't, what's the one cause? The right question is, which layer is dominant right now and which receipts prove it? If you want to be dangerous in a good way, here's the simple system that I use now, and this is where the title becomes real. First, I force myself to state the claim I want to believe in one sentence. If I can't say it clearly, I'm hiding uncertainty. Second, I demand a receipt, not a recycled headline, a primary source, an official data set, or a reputable report. If there is no receipt, I downgrade confidence. Third, I label the layer, macro, paper, or physical. This stops me from mixing time horizons. Fourth, I check whether another layer contradicts it. If physical looks strong but real yields are rising and margin constraints are tightening, I do not act shocked if price stalls. If macro looks supportive but positioning is extremely crowded, I do not act shocked by violent reversals. Fifth, I write down what is unknown, not as weakness, but as honesty. That is the difference between being informed and being manipulated. Now let me bring this home with the confession again because I want you to feel why this matters. Everything I believed about this market was wrong because I believed the market was mainly a story. It's not. It's a system where the price is often the intersection of macro gravity, paper leverage, and physical reality. When you watch only one layer, you get fooled. When you watch all three, you don't become a prophet. You become harder to manipulate. So here is the final reset, the simplest version of the whole video. Macro tells you the cost of money and the background environment. Paper tells you leverage, margin, and positioning constraints. Physical tells you supply, demand, and inventories over time. The price is the intersection. If you want to understand this market, stop arguing about narratives and start tracking receipts. If you want more videos like this, subscribe. This channel will be Receipts First Finance. No hype, no guessing. Every video will be a case file. Every major claim will have a source. Every video will end with what is confirmed and what is unknown. And in the next video, we will take another popular belief, test it against primary sources, and see whether it survives.